Welcome back to the Gregarious Technology YouTube channel. In this video, we'll be going over MECM in a task sequence tutorial, specifically with operating system deployment. We'll take a look at how to prepare, deploy, monitor, and troubleshoot operating system deployments in task sequences. So let's start off with an overview of what we'll be covering in this video. We will start off by talking about preparation, what is needed beforehand in order to prepare for operating system deployment for task sequences. For example, enabling PXE on the distribution point or distribution points, installing and configuring the state migration point if that's an option you wish to have, in capturing user data and restoring user data during the task sequence, dealing with boot images, and dealing with operating system images, what's required of those. Then we will get to the heart of the matter, actually creating task sequences, a task sequence, and configuring it. So we'll go through the wizard. We will configure steps after the task sequence. It has a base configuration setup. We'll take a look at drivers and some of those options. We'll deploy at least one app during the task sequence, so we'll configure that. We'll take a look at the Windows settings and the network settings in the task sequence, and then how to distribute and deploy the task sequence. Once we've got through that, we will actually go through a demo, and we will use the PXE boot OS deployment with a task sequence in our demo and see how that works. We'll use a virtual machine for that. And finally, we'll take a look at monitoring and troubleshooting task sequences. Take a look at the status inside of the console and monitoring that status. Taking a look at some error messages or success messages inside of the monitoring, and also take a look at the log files, both on the client machine and on the MECM server specific to task sequences. Okay, so let's not waste any time. Let's jump right into discussing preparation. So the whole idea behind a PXE boot is that it's a method that you choose to image computers, whereas you set up the computer in the BIOS to enable a PXE boot, and during startup, you'll hit a key such as F12 on Dells to enable the PXE boot search, where it will look for a broadcast for a PXE server. And that PXE server will be the MECM server that has a PXE service on it, and it will have a boot file. And that boot file will indicate all the parameters needed to be able to grab that task sequence from the distribution point and load the task sequence. And after that point, then it'll be in the PXE boot environment to load the mini operating system to run that task sequence and image the computer in what is called the pre-boot environment. So in MECM, in order to configure and enable the PXE service, we do that on the distribution point, the server that has a distribution point role installed on it. In fact, any server that you want that's a distribution point to serve as a PXE boot server. So we'll go to the bottom left pane where it says Administration. And if you've watched my other videos, you're probably pretty familiar with where we're going by this point. And underneath Administration, we're going to Site Configuration. And we're going to expand site configuration. And underneath site configuration, we are going to next go to servers and system roles to find the server that's hosting server or servers that are hosting the distribution point role and which we want to enable PXE on. So we'll go there. We will find the server that we want to enable PXE for the distribution point role. Then we will go to the distribution point on the configuration properties for that server and double click. And then we are going to go to where you see the tab for PXE. And we'll click on that. Unless you have already configured PXE like I have on this distribution point, the top box will be unchecked and everything will be grayed out below it. So you have to check the top box first to enable PXE, and then the options below it will become available. And my recommendation is to not use Windows Deployment Services. It's not needed anymore. It's more complex. It's legacy. So have this configured exactly as I have, and make sure that you've got the box checked that says enable a PXE responder without Windows Deployment Services. And then you've got to fill in the rest of the stuff. Of course, you want to enable unknown computer support for computers that come fresh out of the box. You should enable preferred management points for the PXE requests. That's all part of the MECM configuration that we went over in my other video for installing a primary site server and configuring it. Now, I do also recommend requiring a password when computers use PXE so that you don't have users accidentally hitting that F12 key or whatever it is to get into PXE or intentionally, and automatically launching task sequences to wipe their computers out. So check that box and put a password in. And then it's safe enough to say respond to PXE requests and all network interfaces. If not, you're going to have to click on the secondary one and choose the MAC address that you want it to respond on the network card. So it's going to require the MAC address. So you'd have to grab that from get MAC in a command prompt for that network card that you wish to have as the only one responding to PXE requests. But in my case, especially for a demo, I don't care that it's going to search for any network card. I only have one on this server anyway, so it doesn't really matter. And that's all there is to configuring PXE on the distribution point. So we can go ahead and click OK on that. Just a couple of notes on this. If you do enable PXE, if you look at the multicast tab, what you're going to find is that multicast is disabled when PXE is enabled. It doesn't use multicast. It uses unicast over the switches. And also, if you are using DHCP with another TFTP server that has the PXE boot option, you're going to have a conflict. So you're going to have to resolve that. Can't have two PXE servers broadcasting over the same network, one on DHCP and one being MECM. MECM does not use DHCP anymore. Used to, if you're using Windows Deployment Services, but not anymore. So keep those in mind. So we will now move on to our next topic, which will be talking about the state migration point. Let's talk a little bit about a state migration point why we're even talking about it, discussing it during a task sequence video, and when you might want to use it and what your options are. So MECM uses something called the User State Migration Tool, USMT. And what that does is that manages the user state from pre-imaging to post-imaging. It could be the same computer or it could be a new computer. So what it does is it captures user-specific data before it images, and then it restores that user state data on the operating system after it wipes out images that computer, or if it's going to a new computer for the user, then it will restore the user state data on the new computer that it's going to image. And that's the whole idea behind a state migration point. So in order to use this during a task sequence, as the steps at certain points throughout the task sequence that you would need to do this, capturing, storing, and restore of the user state data, you'll need a system in MECM with the state migration point role on it and configure it so that it knows where to store the data and how to behave and those kind of things. It's worth mentioning that this is optional. Not everybody needs to use this. More recently, organizations have opted to use things such as group policy for redirection of folders like the desktop, favorites, all that kind of stuff, or browser synchronization for their favorites, OneDrive, all that kind of stuff, and just avoid this whole issue of capture, store, and restore. And just have a policy that if user stores data in locations that are not adherent to policies, corporate policies, then it's at risk of losing it and not being able to retrieve it. And include in that our file share. So, if it's something that's shared throughout the organization, obviously it wouldn't be stored on the local computer. So the process basically is the USMT that we'll take a look at in the task sequence when we get to that part is it's going to capture the user state data. It's going to have a location to store that user state data. And that could either be locally on that computer on a partition that you're not going to wipe out in a logical drive. And then you've got to choose potentially computer associations if it's going to be a different computer, so it knows where to restore the data after it backs up the data. And then after that's all done, there will be a restore step. And then eventually it will automatically delete all that user data so you don't continually consume space on whatever location that you are storing this user state migration data, because it's only meant to be temporary anyways. And we'll see more of this later on. And again, it's optional, but I did want to go over it in this video for those of you who wish to deploy this. But in any case, we have to have a fundamental understanding of the options so that when we're going to install the role for a state migration point on some server, a site system of our choosing, we know what we need to pick for options. And that's what we're going to do right now. We need to first have a state migration point server to store this and accommodate the communications of the state migration point. I don't have one yet, so I am going to. We're in the same location we were before, didn't move, servers and site system roles, so we'll stay there. And I'm going to choose a site system. And again, you can always create a new site system through the site hierarchy if you don't have one already picked out and you don't want to install this role co-located on a site system that has other roles if you want a dedicated one. But in my lab environment, I'm going to co-locate it on my management point and primary site system. I'm just going to right click and say add site system roles. If you've watched my other videos by this point, it should be pretty familiar to you that this is pretty much just taking all the default. You'll want to use the site server's computer account to install the site system. If this is a not co-located and it is a new system, you're going to want to make sure that the site system is a local administrator. That machine account is a local administrator on the destination system. Don't forget that. And everything else, especially in a single primary site, should be default unless something is unique to your environment. So we're just going to go ahead and click on next. We don't have a proxy server, so I don't have to specify anything in there. And we are going to go ahead and select what is on the bottom for me, state migration point. We need to install that role, co-locate it on this server, click next, and we're going to have a few options that we have to configure. The first thing it's asking for is a storage location. And so we have no storage location defined yet. We're going to have to click on the button to define a new storage location. And we are going to paste a local drive right there that I have on this server. And we're going to take a look at the other settings in here. It just says how many maximum clients do you want and the minimum free space. Pretty straightforward. Leave those as defaults unless you have performance issues or space issues. And then just adjust if needed and hit OK. Now I could have just as easily used an existing network share instead of a local drive. And if I use a local drive, it will automatically create the share for us. Next, we see this section for the deletion policy right here. And basically it's saying my captured user state data, how long after the restore of the data do you want to delete the captured data? And you might want to increase this a little bit so you can give yourself a little bit of time to adequately validate that that user state data is restored properly and they're not missing anything. Otherwise, it's gone, because you can recover from that user state data using other methods. So keep that in mind. And then we're just going to click on next. This is nice. You can actually break up your state migration points according to boundary groups so that traffic is directed locally according to the boundary groups. You can add them right here as well. In my lab environment, I'm not going to do that, but nice to have that option. And then we're just going to review the settings and click on next and hope for the best. So let's go ahead and do that and let it work. Everything looks like it's green and was a success. So let's close that out. And that is all there is to actually creating the state migration point. So we can now move on to our next module session here to talk about finalizing other little bits and pieces that we need as preparation for the task sequence before we jump into creating the task sequence. So let's go ahead and do that right now. Let's say that we are going to use the user state migration tool, USMT, and the source and destination computers are different for the user state data. We spoke about how we need to create a computer association between the source and destination computers, and we would do that underneath assets and compliance and user state migration. So we're underneath assets and compliance and user state migration. We need to go there. And if we right click on user state migration, we're going to select create a computer association. And it's very simple. For the source computer, we'll click on search. And in my environment, it's very simple because I only have 2 computers, but you can browse. You can go to collections, choose your collection. In this case, I'm going to go to all systems, but you probably want to, in your environment, limit it to the collection that they're in. Actually, I think they're both in the same collection. So I'm going to browse to all Windows servers. And I'm going to click on search. So the source computer is going to be DC3. And the destination computer, if I go to all Windows servers and search again, it's going to be DC4. And then I'll just click on apply and OK. If we take a look at the user accounts tab and not the computer association, we have some more options. By default, it's going to capture all and restore all specified user accounts. And since we didn't specify anything, it's not going to capture anything. So we could go and say capture and restore all user accounts. And then click on apply and OK. Or we could specify which user profiles we want to capture and restore. And then we would go in here and browse for the user profiles, the users in Active Directory that have profiles in this computer, and click on apply and OK. And that's all there is to it. One last thing to note is that you don't actually have to run the user state migration tool as part of the task sequence. You can run the capture at any point before the task sequence as long as the user data is recent and still relevant, and then run the restore afterwards outside of the task sequence. So in essence, you would have a task sequence for the user state migration tool for the capture, store, and restore, and then you would have a task sequence for the operating system deployment. It's just much easier if we have the task sequence do the steps for us in the USMT through the wizard, so we don't have to figure them out. So now we can put USMT to rest until we get to the actual task sequence. It's optional anyways. It's not required. So now we move on to discussing the boot image for the task sequence. Every task sequence has to have a boot image associated with it, otherwise it won't work. So what is a boot image? A boot image in Configuration Manager is a Windows PE pre-boot environment image that's used during an OS deployment, an operating system deployment. Boot images are used to start a computer in Windows PE, the pre-boot environment. This minimal operating system contains limited components and services. Configuration Manager uses WinPE to prepare the destination computer for Windows installation. So it's a bare minimal operating system with bare minimal drivers, just enough to speak with the network in your hard drive for the most part, to get the files it needs to image your computer over the network for Pixie. Actually, even if you're using boot media like a USB flash drive, you'd still need this boot image on your task sequence. So where do we see this boot image, or actually these boot images, inside of MECM? And where do we see them on the network for the booting computer when it's booting to Pixie to find this boot image to load the boot image? Let's take a look at that. So we're going to go pretty much from here on out into the software library. That's where all the operating system deployment stuff is. And the software library is a second item on the bottom left pane. So we're going to go there. And then we're going to go to operating systems. That's where the parent folder is underneath software library for everything that we're going to deal with operating system deployments. Everything except for applications. And that's really outside of it, other than we're going to tag the applications in the steps of the operating system deployment in the task sequence. And then we will go to boot images. Those are our boot images that we just talked about. If we click on that, we're going to see our boot images. And for the most part, unless you're dealing with servers, you're going to be looking at the boot image x64 for 64-bit computers. It used to be an x86, but Microsoft did away with that a long time ago for 32-bit computers. The 64-bit one does still work for 32-bit computers. They changed that a little while back. So keep that in mind. These are actually created when you install the Windows Assessment and Deployment Toolkit, the Windows ADK, when you install your primary site server in MECM. And you don't need to actually replace them unless you go through an upgrade where you have to upgrade the version of ADK. And then again, it should be automatic, but we'll take a look at it anyways. Just in case you have to do a little bit of troubleshooting, you know where it's at. If we take a look at the column that says image ID for this boot image, the image ID is lab 0002 in my environment. So they will automatically update if you replace and don't get rid of the old one, the version number according to your site code. And that's what the image ID is going to be. So if we actually looked at our site, and we went to our primary site server, whack primary site server, and enter on that. And then we go to our site, share, and we will go down to find where it says OSD underneath that share. And we will open that up. And then we will also go to boot and open that up. And then you're going to find the folder for x64. And we'll open that up. And there you're going to find the boot image according to our site code. That's the one it's going to use on the task sequence. Just so you know where it's at. Like if you're troubleshooting and your task sequence isn't loading, let's make sure that that boot file that's specified in the task sequence actually exists in that share. So once again, you're going to follow a similar path in your environment to this right here. That's one of the troubleshooting steps. I know that's kind of jumping ahead like 17 different steps, but as long as we're talking about the boot image right now, sometimes the boot image is the problem. Maybe it got deleted accidentally. Maybe the share's not shared out, whatever. That's where it's actually physically located inside of your share. So that's a share shared out from your MECM's primary site server, or your management point, actually. Each management point, probably. Or distribution point, I should say. So that brings us to our next topic, which is not only when you install the Windows ADK does it create this boot image, but it also distributes it to the distribution points automatically. But if for some reason you manually mess with this, or you upgrade it or something, you're going to have to distribute the content. And that's one thing about the distribution points. Any content that you need on a distribution point has to be distributed to it. You have to manually do it, typically. So if it wasn't distributed, you would right click on it and say distribute content, and then you would find your distribution point or your distribution point group and say all distribution points, but I believe it's already on my distribution point. Oh, maybe it isn't. Huh, look at that. So let's go ahead and do that. Or maybe it just wants to redistribute it. So we've got to remember to do that. A couple of things with the properties on the boot image. All the boot image really needs for drivers typically is generic drivers that it has built into it. You most often do not need to add any drivers unless there's specific hardware in your systems that you're imaging using the task sequence for, whether it's imaging or not imaging, that those built-in drivers for the Windows PE environment don't work for. So you would have to find the Windows PE drivers to add here. And typically you would only need storage, like for a storage array like RAID, and network. That's all it typically needs. And you can't use a Windows driver, so you have to go to the manufacturer's site and download the driver packages, and then find the driver's package and add it here. But in 99.9% of the cases, especially if they're like Dell, HP, Lenovo machines, even VMs, the built-in drivers that come as part of the Windows PE boot image are going to work for the network and storage, unless what I've seen is some of the, again, if you have RAID or some type of storage controller on your systems that's not a standard storage controller, or multiple drives with RAID, that's when you might need to add the Windows PE version of the driver for storage. So keep that in mind. We're not going to mess with that because we don't need it. Again, that was on the drivers tab from the properties of the x64 boot image. Now we're going to take a look at one other thing that sometimes we have to take a look at and ignore all the other tabs. And that is the data source. And again, this is part of troubleshooting from my experience that I've run into in the past, and it's going to save you a ton of time. So we'll click on the data source tab, and you need to make sure that this checkbox is checked. Deploy this boot image from the PXE-enabled distribution point. If you don't have that, your task sequence is not going to pick up that boot image, and your task sequence is going to fail 100% of the time. So if you're, again, most of this is done automatically, when you install the Windows ADK, as long as it's been deployed to all the, or distributed to all the distribution points. But if you're troubleshooting, or if you did this manually, then you are definitely going to want to check these couple of things. And we're almost done with the prerequisites, the preparation prerequisites, whatever you want to call it. We also need an image to deploy, an operating system image to load into our task sequence when we're imaging. Let's say it's Windows 11. So there are two ways to add a package for an operating system image. And the one I'm going to show you right now is the preferred way, the new way, which is basically to just grab the WIM file from the installation media for whatever operating system you are, Windows operating system you are going to deploy. For instance, Windows 11, 24H2. You're going to grab that from the installation media, the WIM file, and you're going to create a package. And you're going to use that package in the task sequence for the Windows image. It's the cleanest way. And then you're just going to add all the apps and settings through the task sequence that you need to be part of the image. And of course, you're going to test it all first and tweak it, and then keep building your task sequence until you're happy with it. The other way is to take a reference machine that already has all the software installed, all the registry settings, all the configurations for everything, and go through the task sequence wizard and select the part that says, instead of deploying an operating system, you are going to select build and capture a reference operating system image. And it'll show you that in just a second. But I first want to show you the best practice approach. And we're not going to go through capturing an image. I just want to show you how to do it. And if you capture an image, it's going to do what we call a sysprep. It's going to remove all the user-specific data. But it's kind of messy. I mean, if there's any bad configurations on that, you're deploying all those bad configurations, or any kind of misconfigurations or corruption or anything like that, to all the machines that you image. So it's not best practice, but I'll show you how to do it anyways. But let's get back to creating your operating system image to use in the task sequence. The best practice, recommended, usual typical way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to that share that I know the boot file is in for operating system deployment, that I know has the correct permissions and everything. And I'm going to create a folder for each operating system that I want to have an image for, each version, each feature update, I should say. And inside there, I'm going to copy that WIM file, and just the WIM file, to there, so that I can use it to create a package. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my installation media for Windows 11 24H2, and I'm going to go to the folder called Sources, and inside there, I'm going to copy a file called install.wim to that folder in that share that I created. And that will be the WIM file that I will use as the base for my operating system image when I create the package. So we'll let that copy, and we'll come back in just a minute. Okay, so that WIM file has finished copying, but I do want to point out one thing about the location that I mentioned. That share for that we've got up here for the operating system image, by default, that is going to be installed into the program files folder for Configuration Manager. And if you don't change the location of your installation for MECM, which is why I say in my other videos, best practice is to install MECM on a drive that has a lot of space, because there's some shares that you cannot move, and that's one of them. And if you put files in there, it could fill up your operating system drive. So I would choose a different location if you installed Configuration Manager on the C drive, because these image files are going to get pretty big and you could run out of space. So then you would just create a share and put it in a different location. But because I did it the way I did it, I'm safe. So keep that in mind. But I've got that file copied now. I can go ahead and minimize this. Well, actually, I'm first going to copy the share location so that when I go in to create this image, by right-clicking on Operating System Images, which is right here, and then choosing Add Operating System Image, it's going to say, well, where's your image? So I'm going to click on Browse, and then I'm just going to paste that right in the window. It's going to be a network share. Cannot be, you can't specify it by its local drive. It won't work. And then I find the WIM file that we copied. If this is a WIM file that contains multiple versions, you are going to want to select the version that you want to install. So I'm going to say, well, this is Pro, and yeah, I agree. Don't forget to do those, else you're going to have issues. If it's just for one version, if you click on a different version, that will cause it to fail too. Quite honestly, I don't remember, and I can't tell by the file name, the ISO file, whether it has multiple versions or not. So I'm going to try Pro, but I'm going to keep that in mind. I may have to go back and upload that image again, create that image package, and just not extract a specific version, but I'm going to try it. Let's click on Next. Language, you want to select your language. English United States is in here somewhere. X64. You don't want the 32-bit. And then you want to give it a name that's going to help you identify this image so that you know the operating system and the feature update version of the image file. So, and I'm going to put 24H2 in there, so that will show up in the version, and you can put some comments in there. I'm not going to put any comments in there. And click on Next and hope for the best. If we did something wrong, it may fail. We may have to go back. So we got a success on creating the operating system image as a package. And what we need to do now is we cannot forget that that is not distributed yet. So we're going to have to right-click on it and distribute it to a distribution point or distribution point group or multiple. So let's click on Next. And I just have one distribution point. I do have a distribution point group, but there's only one distribution point in there. So I'm just going to click Distribution Point, hit OK, click Next, Next, and Close. And then we're going to want to check later on in monitoring, and we'll see that later on in the video, how to check monitoring for the success of all this stuff. But we want to make sure that that successfully got distributed. There could be issues if it didn't get distributed. then we've got to troubleshoot that. Otherwise, it's never going to work. Your task sequence won't work if it can't find the content. And so you can actually, if you want a quick and easy step to check out yourself right now, you can go to content status right there and walk through it, and it'll take you to the monitoring console where you can find out and just sit there and wait and keep refreshing until it says either error or success on the distribution of that image package. And lastly, for this module, I'm not going to actually go through all the steps, but I want to show you how to do this. We talked about it earlier. If you want to create a reference image, and you absolutely want to capture everything on that machine and go through a sysprep and all that kind of stuff, contrary to my advice and best practice, go to Operating System Upgrade Packages. And you're going to, I'm sorry, wrong one. Go to Task Sequences. And then right-click. And what you want to do is you want to say Create Task Sequence Media. And wait for the wizard to pop up. Now we have a few options in here. If you were not going to choose Pixie and you wanted to do the bootable media, this is the one that you would choose, and it'd walk you through creating a flash drive to boot to instead of Pixie for your boot method and booting to the Windows pre-boot environment and grabbing your task sequence, choosing your task sequence and grabbing it. But we're going to do capture media. And if you read that, it says create media used to capture an operating system deployment image from a reference computer. And we're just basically going to follow the instructions. And I probably won't do much more with this other than just show you how far we can get. And basically, we're going to say, specify where the media for this image deployment. We'll use CD, DVD media, or removable USB drive. I'm going to say removable USB drive. Now, I don't have anything in there, but if you did, you would see your drive letter in there. And then it's going to ask you for a staging folder and a media label and all that kind of stuff. But I'm not going to go through all that. It's beyond the scope of just task sequence stuff. And if you're interested and that's the way you want to do it, check out this article and it'll walk you through step by step how to create the media and how to capture the OS from a reference machine. You could probably just do a Google search for this article if you don't want to type in that whole URL, and it'll walk you through each step along the way. And I recommend if that's the approach you want to take, go ahead and do it. I just don't do it that way, and I don't think most seasoned experts or seasoned pros in MECM or SCCM do it this way. So I'm going to hit cancel on that. And that brings us to the end of our discussion on boot image and operating system image and boot media and all that kind of stuff. And it actually brings us also to the end of our preparation. Now we're actually going to move on to the next module, which is getting into creating our actual operating system deployment task sequence and all the steps involved with that. The real heart of what we want to get to in this video. But we couldn't get to it until we talked about all the requirements and preparation that we need to do. So without further ado, let's jump right into that. So now we're at the point where we can actually create the task sequence and configure it. So we'll take a look at some common options once we create the task sequence and various steps that we can create along the way to perform during the task sequence. Things such as installing applications, installing driver packages, variables, scripts, etc. And we'll take a look at some of the options on each one of the steps and some variables as well. So without talking too much about it, let's jump right into it. We are still in the same place. We are in the software library on the bottom left pane. And underneath the software library, we are still underneath operating systems. But now we're going to move on to where it says task sequences and click on task sequences. So what we are going to do is we're going to use the wizard to set up most of the steps in the task sequence. Then we're going to edit the task sequence and modify it just a little bit. So what we need to do is go to task sequences, right click and say create task sequence. And then we'll have a menu with a list of options. We saw this earlier, but we're going to choose a different option now. And to deploy an operating system with an image that we created, we didn't capture an image, we're going to select the very first one on the list, install an existing image package, the one we created earlier. And then we'll click next. And then we'll give it a name and description. The task sequence name should indicate the type of deployment and probably the version too, because the image is specific to the version. So we are naming this executives because we're going to target executive computers with this type of software. And the version is Windows 11 24H2. So capture that in the task sequence name so it's easy to identify when we have possibly multiple task sequences deployed to any collection, and then give it a description. And we have to select the boot image for the Windows PE environment for it to load. And there's our boot image, 64-bit one. Click on next. Now we're going to select the image package we created, which is the Windows 11 Pro 24H2. And actually, it might make sense if we said back here that it was a Pro version, in case we have a couple of different versions for executives. And the image index is already selected because we limited it to that index when we created the image. We almost always want to partition and format the target computer before installing the operating system to have a clean install. And then if you're deploying BitLocker on these machines, it's best to have the wizard configure BitLocker. So configure the task sequence for use with BitLocker. If you're not using BitLocker, deselect that. And if you're in co-management mode with Intune and Intune is handling that, then you can deselect that as well. Although you might want to still leave that checked and modify it later just to disable BitLocker and let Intune take over after that. Enter your product key. Now, I highly recommend that you have a KMS server, key management server. and use the KMS key for activation with KMS, not a MAK key, and put that in there. Next, you have two options down below regarding the local administrator username and password. And in my scenario, I want to specify the second one, enable the account and specify the administrator password. Now, it's just for the built-in administrator account. This is not going to allow you to create a different administrator account. If you wanted to do that, then you would have to use a script. And maybe we'll go through that in the task sequence, add a script, and show you what that script would look like. The other option would be randomly generate the local administrator password and disable it. That's a very common option. So you can do that and then use a script to create a local administrator password, or just rely on the domain admin's membership in a domain environment. So I'm just going to enter the password for the local administrator account. Okay. Click on next. And then we're going to join a domain. We will browse for both the domain and the organizational unit. So there's my domain. If you have a forest with multiple domains, you'll probably see that listed here, and you have to browse for the domain. And then I'm going to look for the organizational unit that it will place the imaged computers into. And then I've got to specify an account that has permissions to actually join that machine to the domain and move it into that OU. I'm going to use a domain admin account, but typically the technicians that are running this might just use their own account if they're creating task sequences. And in that case, you want to make sure that those accounts just have the least permissions needed and just the permissions to join it to a domain. So let's go ahead and do this. And then put the password in. And then you want to verify by clicking on verify, and just take the OU that you specified earlier. Don't change that, because that's where you're going to join it to. And click on test, and boom, was successful. So we know that account will be able to join it to that OU. Hit OK. We'll click on next. It's got to install the Configuration Manager client and take the default package, unless for some reason there's a newer update and you didn't push the newer update yet. Then you can browse for a different client package. Click next. And now we're on the section for state migration. If you're not going to do state migration, then just deselect this. I would recommend keeping this on, because you can always disable it for the step later on, and then you've got a template that you can copy for future task sequences that you would use the state migration for. So I would recommend keeping this on, and when we look at the task sequence later, I'll show you how to disable that whole group or parts of the group, the steps. So you have options. It's already got the package for the USMT, and that was created when we configured USMT. And it says, what do you want to do? Do you want to save the settings locally or on the state migration point? We had configured it for the state migration point, but we can always change that here inside the task sequence. And if you wanted to do that, you would just click on that and delete the default setting, but we're going to say save user settings on the state migration point, which is network share. And then you do want to leave enabled capture network settings and capture Microsoft Windows settings. And we'll see later on that we can disable those and which use cases we'd keep that enabled for. So we'll leave that on for now. And we will click next. I am going to leave it for software updates on do not install software updates because it'll take forever to download those updates in the imaging process. The operating system deployment will take a long time for every machine, and it'll be longer to hand out the machines, the desktops, laptops, whatever, to employees, staff, if you have to wait for the Windows updates. I recommend that you instead use the automatic deployment rules to install the updates after they've been imaged with the operating system deployment. So I'm going to leave it at that. And now it's asking, do you want to install applications during the operating system deployment? So I'm going to do one now, and then I'll do another one during the modification of the task sequence so you can see how to do that. So I've got two applications I've already created packages for ahead of time. I'm going to choose the Office 365 one. And notice this box down here, pretty important. If an application installation fails, continue installing other applications in the list. I recommend always clicking on that so your whole task sequence doesn't fail and you can get to the log files and see what happened with that one application and troubleshoot it. Next. And then just review all your settings and make sure that they're all the same. Go back with previous if you need to. Click next, and boom, our task sequence is done. So we'll hit close. You see the task sequence up here at the top. And all the information for it. One thing to point out is on the properties, you've got some options, but really the only thing you want to really make sure of is that on the Advanced tab, you have this selected, use a boot image, and the correct boot image loaded, so that if you continue to use the same task sequence, but you change the version of ADK, Windows ADK Assessment and Deployment Toolkit, and you've got a new version of the boot image, you might have to change that to the newer version on the older task sequences, and then you just browse to it and choose the newer version. Pretty much everything else, just keep the same unless you want to tweak it a little bit. You can take the maximum allowed runtime of the task sequence down to like 60 minutes or something like that. You know, if you want to do some advanced stuff like run another program before you run the task sequence, you can do that. All that kind of stuff. Suppress task sequence notifications. Disable this task sequence on computers where it's deployed. And we'll just leave it at this for now. We want to run it on any platform because we already, it'll automatically know that it's the wrong platform if it's 32-bit processor or something like that. So hit apply and OK. And next, we're going to take a look at editing the task sequence. So let's jump right into that. Let's go ahead and edit one of the task sequences. So the one we just created, let's go there, right mouse click, and we'll go to edit. And it will bring up all of the groups and steps and subgroups and substeps and all that stuff. So let's take a look at it. The folders are groups, and they're used to basically group together a list of steps. And the only real thing you have on the groups themselves are the options, so that inheritance can flow down to the steps and child groups. And underneath options for any of the groups or steps themselves, you're going to see both disable the step and continue on error as options, so that you can control the flow of the task sequence if you're having issues, or if you just want to change it up a little bit with disabling the step. And then add condition. So any step, any folder, any group can have conditions, and that's important. What are the conditions? Well, these are the list of conditions: if statements, a task sequence variable, operating system version, operating system language, file properties, folder properties, registry setting, WMI query, and installed software. So notice how this whole group right here is part of the USMT that we created through the wizard. And what it's saying underneath the conditions is that the task sequence variable SMSTS, SMS task sequence, WinPE, the Win pre-boot environment, equals false. So you're not going to capture settings if you run this from Windows. Obviously, you can't capture files and settings if you're running it from the Windows pre-boot environment. If you want to use USMT, you have to run it through the Software Center by booting to Windows and launching the task sequence from the Software Center for MECM. You can't run a USMT capture and restore from the pre-boot environment. So we've got all the steps underneath this group to capture the user file settings, including request storage, capture the files and settings, and release the state storage. And down here at the end of the task sequence, when everything's done, we're going to restore those user file and settings. That is, if we run the task sequence from the Software Center. And we're not going to do that. But I wanted to show you how this works if you were going to use USMT. So we're just going to run this from the pre-boot environment and just have this as options. So I could technically go into here and disable this step, and go into here and also disable this step. Now remember, that's underneath the options. If I haven't pointed that out already, that's underneath the options tab when you go to the group or step. And then I still have all those there to reference or to use in the future if I want to copy this task sequence, or if I want to just enable it in the future for running it from the software center, whatever. Those are still there. I can re-enable them. I can modify them. I can reference them, whatever. They're not gone. So I don't have to do them from scratch. But they won't be running this task sequence. So I'm going to hit apply and OK. And let me show you how we can copy this. So we can right mouse click and we can simply hit copy and it will create a copy. Underneath task sequences. And it will label it sequentially as the next one in the package ID. And you could rename it. So we can go ahead, go to properties, and say, this is USMT. And now we'll go into the USMT version, edit it, and we'll go ahead, for instance, and enable those steps. Or disable the disable, which enables it. And now we've got a USMT version, and we got one without the USMT, one used for PE. So technically I could go in here, go back into properties, and say this one is for PE, pre-boot environment. So let's go into the PE version, since that's one we're going to use. And let's look at a few things. So we've got a group here for installing the operating system. And what's it say? The first step is restart in PE. And that's just a step that is defined. And by the way, you can add any steps by looking at the categories of steps anywhere along the way in finding what you want to do in the task sequence. Run a command line underneath general, run a PowerShell script, restart computer, run another task sequence, software, install application, install package, install updates, format and repartition disk, enable BitLocker, disable BitLocker. So all these are underneath add. You could add any step along the way. There's your user state ones, images, apply images, all that kind of stuff, upgrade operating system, and then drivers. And that's where you're going to find them. So when we went through the wizard, it just applied some of those steps. So it says restart in Windows PE. Then it says I'm going to partition disk 0. And then I'm going to partition disk 0 if it's UEFI. We got one for BIOS. If it's BIOS, enable disk, or if it's a UEFI, enable disk. Then we're going to provision BitLocker, pre-provision BitLocker. Whereas up here, this step was to disable BitLocker if it was already enabled in Windows. And then we can actually do this. We can enable this step, or actually, we can do this. Disable everything up to that point. And just one more. Hit apply. and just keep the disable BitLocker in case BitLocker was already enabled. Okay. And then we can pre-provision it when it goes to install the operating system steps. And then it says apply operating system. And notice underneath apply operating system, it's got our image. We specified that. We could always change that. We could copy this task sequence and update the image if we had a newer version like 25H2. And then boom, we've got a brand new task sequence and image by just updating the image. Don't have to go through it all again. Apply Windows settings. Here's some of the stuff we set in there. The product key, organization name. We can change that. That's not actually our organization name. I'm not sure why that went in there. We can change that right here. And any of this other information, here's where we specified the local administrator settings for the password. Keep it, and there's a password. We've got the time zone. We can switch the time zone in this task sequence. We can optionally specify some additional settings for the installation of Windows right here. If we wanted to, if we needed to. Then underneath network settings, we've got our domain settings right here for both the domain and organizational unit and account to join it with. So we can always change that if we needed to. And then there's this generic apply device drivers, which says use the generic device drivers for Windows from the from the operating system image to install drivers to the operating system. Now, that's probably not ideal. You probably want the manufacturer's drivers. So what we're going to do is we're going to come up all the way to the top. And we are going to go ahead and add a new group. And we're going to actually, let's move that up. And by right mouse clicking, you can move it up and down. Move up, move down. And we're going to call this install device drivers. We're going to have a whole group for installing different device drivers. And we're going to try to put it way down here towards the bottom. So I'm going to actually, it's a little funky. There we go. Now it's at the right level. It's not underneath here. It's got its own group and steps. So I just created a new group, and this is very typical that you want to do this. You want to apply the correct drivers and have it detect what kind of system it is to apply which drivers. So for instance, we'll go in here and we will do a new step. We'll go ahead and we'll say drivers, apply driver package. And what we're going to do is we are going to select the driver package for the systems, for each system that we want to apply this task sequence for. And then we're going to set some variables that say, if it's this model, apply this driver package. If it's this model, apply this driver package, and so on for all of our systems. But we have to create those driver packages ahead of time. If you haven't done that, check out my video on installing your first primary site system on Server 2025. I go through the Dell integration driver package toolkit, whatever it's called, I forget, for MECM. Really easy to create driver packages for Dell. HP has one. Lenovo, I think, has one. So I created the driver package ahead of time for one of them, And we'll just go ahead and select that. And now I've got a group, and the first step says apply driver package, but I'm going to change that to apply driver Dell latitude 5300, because it's a driver for the 5300. And I'm going to hit apply on that. Now, here's the tricky part. Not that tricky. It's pretty easy, but you just need to know this. We are going to add a condition, and it's going to be a query WMI. And what we're going to do, we're going to leave it at root CIMV2. And we're going to keep this as a template. So you might want to pause the screen if you don't know this query yet. And basically what it's saying query WMI on this system and look for Win32 computer system where the manufacturer is like Dell as a variable, wildcard on the beginning and end, and the model is like, again, variable on the beginning and end, latitude space 5300. So if it has a match on Dell and latitude 5300, now typically you could just do model like latitude 5300 because there's no other manufacturer out there that has latitude 5300. But if you just did 5300, you might have to do Dell. But this is very specific, about as specific as you can. Now, I don't think the test query is going to work. As far as on running this task sequence, because I don't actually have that, I'm going to run it on a VM, but it's just going to skip over it if it doesn't find that in the WMI query. So it's no big deal. It does say it contains valid syntax. So you'll want to test it just to make sure it doesn't have invalid syntax. And that's good. So my WMI query is good. And boom. So what we're saying now is apply this driver package under the condition that you query WMI and we find this information, specific information for Dell Latitude 5300 for the computer and manufacturer, the model and manufacturer and model in WMI underneath Win32 _ computer system. And let's hit apply on that. So we'll only apply those drivers when it's a Dell Latitude 5300. And you do the same for every model that you want to apply this task sequence to, so that you get the very specific drivers you need for each model that you're going to apply this task sequence to. So if you had an Optiplex, whatever, you have to first download the driver packages from, the add-in, the plugin, whatever you want to call it, the extension in MECM. And then once you have the package created, you go in here and you do what we just did. And you could do it for Dell and HP in the same task sequence, or you could break them up into different task sequences if for some reason certain models or certain manufacturers had different software, for instance, that you needed to install, like the management software. You could either break them up into task sequences, or you could find out what the WMI query is and say only install this software, just like we say only install the driver if it meets these conditions. So the WMI query is very powerful and it's a very common task. So I'm only going to do one driver for demonstration purposes. I'm not going to waste your time or mine on extending this video, but that's a very important group and steps to understand in this procedure. So let's look at the last default group and steps that we set up through the wizard and see what we've got in there. And we'll take a look at one more thing. And so this is the MECM client, the client software to be able to communicate with the system and manage the system. So that package has to be there. We saw that in the wizard. We selected in the wizard to enable BitLocker. So there's a bunch of options for that. And you can change these options. We didn't have these options in the wizard, but we have them here. So how are we going to handle TPM and startup key? We can change all that here. I'm actually going to probably disable this step because I could enable it because I'm going to be using version 2 of Hyper-V virtual machine, but I don't really want to mess with it on a virtual machine right now. And underneath the encryption mode, we've got a bunch of other settings down here. You'll want to go through all of this if you are going to use BitLocker encryption and make sure it's the way you want. So for instance, you probably want to do XTS AES 256-bit, use full disk encryption, store the recovery key in Active Directory, wait for the BitLocker to complete the drive encryption on all drives before Configuration Manager continues to run the task sequence. And, maybe skip this. Okay, hit apply. Set the settings the way you want them, but I'm actually going to disable this step. So I'm going to go up here and I'm going to disable this step, but I'm going to keep it in the task sequence just in case I want to copy this task sequence for other systems that I do want BitLocker encryption on. And then we move on underneath the group for setup operating system to install applications. So what we have here underneath options is an option to continue on error for the whole step of install applications. And that's a good idea to select. Now, each application, you'll be able to do that as well, but I want to make sure that's done for this whole step, because what's going to happen is you have the option to add underneath the step multiple applications. I could add another application. And then what you want is if this application fails, you want this application to succeed, to continue, and the task sequence to continue. Now, I'm going to do this a little differently because I like to separate them out. So I'm going to say this one is install Office 365. Hit apply. Okay. And again, if I weren't going to isolate it to just one application, I could add another application in here, but I don't like to do that because I'm going to do each one and say continue on error. So now I'm going to go up here and I'm going to go to add software, install application, and do the other one in a different step in the same group. So now I'm going to go to Google Chrome. Okay. And I'm going to call that install Google Chrome. And you could say the version up there, but it's in there. And I'm going to go to options and I'm going to say continue on error. And now I can see each step along the way. And that also helps when you're viewing the log file to understand which application it failed on, because the log file, or at least the monitoring, it's just going to say it failed on this step, and you're not going to know which application it failed on unless they're different steps. So just something that I learned from the field to separate them out. There's a couple of reasons I do it, and those are the reasons. And then I'm going to do another group underneath install operating system. So I'm going to add a group, and I'm going to call this scripts. And I'm probably going to move it right down to the bottom. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add underneath general, I believe it is, run PowerShell script, or you could do a command line. And what's going to happen is you're going to have to create a package for that PowerShell script. Or alternatively, you can actually now select, enter a PowerShell script right here. And if you click on Add Script, it'll bring up a window where you can actually paste your script. Hit OK, or open code editor, which is kind of neat. It'll check your code. And hit OK. Then you probably want to go down and say, bypass the execution policy, so we don't have to have it signed. And you have some additional options for where you want to start it in. They're optional, timeout and run this step as the following account. And so if you so choose then add those in and then hit apply and set those into effect. And so now we've covered most of the common tasks and parts and components of a task sequence. The things that you would commonly need to configure to get this to run for an operating system deployment. Next, we will get into deploying, monitoring, and troubleshooting a task sequence. So let's not waste any time. Let's jump right into it. Okay, so before we get into deploying the task sequence to collections, we want to verify that all the content that's related to our task sequence for operating system deployment is actually distributed to the distribution points that are needed to deploy the task sequence to. This includes application packages, driver packages, the operating system image, the boot image, and possibly script packages or other packages if those were included as packages that need to be deployed as part of your task sequence. And that also includes the Configuration Manager client package and the user state migration tool for Windows package, the USMT package. So we'll very quickly go down through the list for our task sequence, the stuff that we need, the packages we need, and the driver packages and the images that we need, and validate that they were successfully distributed to a distribution point that we need to be able to deploy this task sequence. There's a couple of different ways we can do it, and we'll start off with one way and we'll switch to the other way. So we are still in the software library. We'll start off there. And if we wanted to check any one of our content distribution status, we can just go to the content itself. So for instance, we can go to Applications and click on Applications, find our applications, and what you're going to see is down below, it's going to show you the status of the distribution of the content. So we can see that it's green and it says success of 1 on the Google Chrome. If we switch over to Office 365, we're getting the same thing. We're getting green and we're getting green success 1. So our applications are good to go. So the second way we can do this is we can actually click on the link for any package or any content that says content status, and where that's going to bring us is to a different pane where all the content status is, and that's the second method. So if we click on content status, what that's going to do is that's going to bring us to the pane for monitoring, and then distribution status, and then specifically whatever content you clicked on to get the status of the distribution of that content. So we can get there directly to find out whether it failed or succeeded or it's in progress and all that kind of stuff. But to get more details, you have to dig a little deeper. You have to click on the view status. And if we do that, the hyperlink down here, it's actually going to bring you to a window. And what we're looking at is up top here, we're going to have several tabs. And it's going to be in one of those phases. Typically, it's going to be either success, in progress, or error. Very seldom is it unknown, unless there's a communication error. If it's successful, great. We don't have to do anything else. It's going to tell you some more details down here. If you double click on any of these, it'll give you all the details. So if it's successful, we don't really care. It worked. If it's in progress, it'll tell us. We just wait. So we're just clicking on the different tabs up top. In progress, we just wait for it to finish or to error out. If there's an error, that's where we really need to dig a little deeper. Now, this one doesn't have an error, so we're not going to get anything for an error. But let's pretend we did. What it would look like is very similar to the success. You would see the asset details down here, a little brief description, and then just like with a success, you can double click on the asset details and take a look at the information in there to get some quick information on why you ran into an error. We'll get into some other methods and log files a little deeper later for errors when we get into the troubleshooting. But for right now, that's a quick way that might indicate right off the bat an error that you know the resolution for. And you could say, oh, well, darn it, that's why it's not working for the distribution anyways. This is just for the distribution. We haven't even deployed the operating system yet. We haven't deployed the task sequence to deploy the operating system. Now, if you prefer to stay in distribution status and look at all the content side by side and switch between, you can go up to distribution status, click on that, and go to content status, which is below it. and you're going to see all of your content. So this list can get pretty big, especially if you have a lot of drivers packages, and if you have a lot of applications and boot images, all that kind of stuff. You can always search it. So let's say we, wanted Office 365. We know we have an application with a package for Office 365. We can just type in Office and boom. We've got, and I'm in the search window up top, just typing in a search and then clicking on either enter or the actual search button. And to clear the search and get back to your list, you just click the little X button, which is right there. And that's it for actually monitoring the distribution. Pretty straightforward. At this point, it's basic stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and sort through my list here up top by just clicking on type, and it will alphabetically sort for me. And I'm going to go through each one that's in my task sequence, each content package, and just verify really quickly that they all look like they're distributed. This is my driver package right there. I've got the operating system image, configuration manager, client package. I don't need the upgrade. I don't need that. I do need the USMT client package. So everything looks good. And we're now ready to actually deploy the task sequence to one or more collections. So we'll move into that phase of our module and talk about that. So we've got to figure out which collection or which collections do we want to deploy this task sequence to. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to our collections. And in order to do that, we've got to go to Assets and Compliance in the bottom left pane. Click on that. And most often, it's going to be a device collection. And if you want to know more about collections, check out my other videos. But it's pretty straightforward. It's just like a group of devices that you want to deploy stuff to. That could be a task sequence. It could be an application. Could be a lot of different stuff, or just a script. Doesn't have to be a task sequence, but most often it's a task sequence or an application or a package or something like that. There's a special collection by default, and it's called All Unknown Computers. And that collection allows you to push task sequences and use a PXE boot with task sequences without having the configuration manager client installed on it, so that when you open a computer out of the box, the out-of-the-box experience for the first time, a brand new computer, it's going to recognize that computer on the network. You're going to boot up that computer, and configuration manager is going to say, hey, this isn't in my database. It's an unknown computer. Do I have any deployments for unknown computers? And so the typical deployments you're going to do to all unknown computers is going to be an operating system deployment, because that's the very first thing that you need to do is get an operating system on it, image it the way you want it for your organization. We did put a password on PXE boot so that people can't just PXE boot to the task sequence, but do stay away from the all other collections. It's like anything else that has all on it, all mobile devices, all desktop, all provisioning, because then it will show up in the software center and they might see it and click on it and be able to actually, wipe out their machine if there is no password on the task sequence itself. So we will try to stay away from those collections. And then it's pretty common, typical, to have a collection called something like reimage computers, so that you can just dump a set of computers that you're going through reimaging for into that collection and deploy your operating system task sequence to that, and they will get that advertisement for the task sequence, and that will be available to them. But your task sequence will only be available to the collections that you deploy it to. So if you try to PXE boot to a computer or use boot media or the software center to find that task sequence to a computer that's not in the collection that that task sequence has been deployed to, you're not going to see it. It's not going to work. So now we're coming full circle again. We're coming back to the software center to actually deploy our task sequence, and then we'll go through the demo and make sure it works. So let's go back into the software library by clicking on it in the bottom left-hand pane. Let's go back to Operating Systems and Task Sequences, and click on Task Sequences to get to our task sequences. And this is the one that I want to deploy right now, the Executive Windows Pro 11 24H2 PE. So I'm going to right click on that. And I'm going to select Deploy. Before we get to that, interestingly enough, there is a distribute content. You don't have to distribute the task sequence itself, but the associated content will be in there if you choose that option. So you can actually do this as a safeguard to make sure that all the content associated with the task sequence is deployed to whatever distribution point, if you haven't done it already. But we typically just do it when we create the content so we don't forget. So let's go to Deploy. And it will bring up a wizard. And then we're going to have to browse to say which collection we want to deploy it to. So we'll go ahead and do that. And it's going to give us some warning. We can safely ignore that. We'll click on OK. And we will go ahead and select all unknown computers so that we can do the out-of-the-box experience. Just boot it up, hit the F12 key to boot into PXE, and select the task sequence. And we're not going to mess with any of this other stuff. We're just going to hit Next. And be careful on this next step. We will leave the purpose at available instead of required. Now, if we're going to just keep this to isolated to PXE boot and we have a password, it's pretty safe to save required so that when it boots up, it's just going to automatically jump into that task sequence. But also, we might want to choose between task sequences, so we're going to leave it at available. But we do want to say only media and PXE on make available to the following. Because if we leave it at the default, which is only Configuration Manager clients, these machines that we want to image aren't going to boot into from PXE into a machine that has a client installed and available during PXE. So we're going to make sure that we change that to only media and Pixie. Now the media would be the boot media if you created it, that flash drive. You could just say Configuration Manager clients, media, and Pixie if you wanted it to be available on the software center so that you could choose it for USMT purposes. But I'm just going to use this for Pixie. This is a PE, pre-boot environment purpose. So I'm going to click Next. And then I am going to check the box that says schedule when this will become available, because I want it to become available instantaneously. Now, it might take 15-20 minutes for this to actually become available, but as soon as possible, basically. So it's going to take the current time, unless you want to schedule it for the future, but I never do that. And I don't have it expire. So we're going to click Next. This page is really for when you're running it in the software center, and we are not running it in the software center, so we're going to have limited options anyways. Just leave it at the default and click Next. And you could create an alert for 10% failure or higher. I'm just going to leave that at unchecked, and I will manually check to make sure my deployments are 100%, because we can do that in monitoring. We're going to assume that we're not using branch cache, but these next sections are talking about if it can't find the content in the boundary group that this machine is on the same subnet as, can it go and look for it in other places? And I say, why not? So clients will always try to get content from the distribution points in the current boundary group. In addition, interaction with distribution points in neighbor boundary groups can be contacted, so you allow that. When this content is not available on any distribution points in current and neighbor boundary groups, you can also allow the client to use a distribution point in the default boundary group, so I'll allow that as well. Next. And just review the settings. Click on Next. And close. And then what we're going to see is at the bottom tab for deployments, you can click on that now, and you're going to see everything it got deployed to. So if we go ahead and deploy it to another collection, you would see that other collection show up in there. So for instance, let's run through this really quickly. We're going to choose re-image computers this time. Yes, it doesn't contain any members. That's fine, because we're going to put members in there in the future. Next. Available. Medium Pixie. Next. Immediately. Next. 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 Close. And now you're going to see both of the collections that it's deployed to. And the compliance percent, let me show you that real quickly, is at 0 right now, because we haven't actually booted up any computers. We haven't actually put any computers in either one of the collections. The all unknown computers would be any unknown computer that we do a Pixie boot to, and that didn't exist yet. And we didn't put any existing computers with a Configuration Manager client into the reimage computers collection. So they're both at 0, but we should see that change once we get going with the demo. So that is all there is to deploying for the most part, the main stuff. There's some options, but you can read up on those if it suits your environment and you wish for those options. Now we're going to get into the fun stuff. Let's jump right into the demo. Let's give it a shot. Let's see if we run into issues. And if we do, let's troubleshoot those issues. So that's our next module. Let's jump right into it. All right. So we are going to hit the key we need to boot into Pixie. We see that we're connected to our MECM server, and we see that we're loading the boot file down at the bottom. So we're good so far. Give it a minute to load up the boot file, and then we should see the task sequence load. And as anticipated, it's prompting us for the password for Pixie that we put on the distribution point in the configuration. So let's type that in and click on next and see what happens. And we see our list of task sequences available, and we only have one assigned to it. So let's click on next. And there we go. Boom. It's starting the task sequence. So far, so good. So this can take a while. What we'll do is we will pause the video and let this run for a little while, and then we'll check back in a little bit. We're at 96% on the operating system image download, so that should complete soon and go on to the next step. Now it's applying the operating system. This will take some time, so we'll let that run, and we'll check right back in as soon as it's almost done. It's applying the image. It's beginning to apply the image. So let's show that part of it. So we're almost done with applying image 1. Let's hold on for a minute and see what happens next in the steps. So it failed on apply Windows settings. So we'll take a look at the task sequence. We're going to restart anyways, see if it continues, and troubleshoot that part of the task sequence. So let's go ahead and click on restart now. We'll let it boot back up, and we'll see if it continues for the task sequence or if it tries to recommence. And we'll take a look at the task sequence log to see if we can figure out where it failed. Just as a review, where we're at in the task sequence step that it's failed is the apply Windows settings. And here's all the settings that we have set. And let's take a look and see if we said continue on error. We did not. So we can go ahead and click on that. That's just the local administrator account and the product key and the organization name. Not the end of the world if it fails in that, because it's going to join the domain later anyways. So let's go ahead and do that, and maybe we'll run it again, the task sequence, if it fails. And it's checking for updates anyways. And then you'll find it'll do that. So it's going through the out-of-the-box experience right now with Windows 11. Let's let that happen for a little while. And it's giving us a notification that the PC is going to restart. So we'll wait for that to happen, and then we'll check back in. And it looks like the task sequence is completed. I don't know which steps yet have failed. So I'm going to attempt to log on and then check out the task sequence and check out on the local computer what happened and what didn't. Okay, so it doesn't look like it took the username and password that we specified for the local username, and it did disable the administrator account. So very interesting. Let's see if it'll take the domain credentials. I doubt it because it doesn't look like it joined the domain. Nope, that didn't work either. So we're in kind of a bad state here with the install. The task sequence, we'll probably try to troubleshoot the task sequence and then run it again. And this is sometimes expected that you'll have some issues, and it was definitely expected in the video that we'd run through some troubleshooting. So I guess it's good that we ran into some of it right off the bat. So let's see if it took the script that I set the local account for, local administrator. See if that worked. Well, that didn't work either. So at this point, because I went into the apply Windows settings, which are basically just the local settings, and the product key, which I am a little bit concerned about, but I'm at a standstill. So because I went in and said continue on error, it should theoretically go to the next step if we run the task sequence again and join it to the domain so I can get in. And that's what we really need anyways. So let me go back one last time and see what it might not have liked about the apply Windows settings. So what I've done is I've said, instead of setting the local administrator account password, I've just said randomly generate it and disable the administrator account, the default administrator account. I've set the locales and all that kind of stuff on top of just the time zone. And then I applied, and we're going to just run through the task sequence again. I won't bore you with all the steps again, and we'll pick up where we left off and see if we have any better luck. Just so you see that we're actually running through it again. I'll show you a couple of screens, but yeah, not going to bore you with all the steps again. Okay, we're back near the completion of the downloading of the image, and it's applying the operating system. It's applying the image. The next step would be apply Windows settings, and that's where it got stuck last time. So we'll check back in right at the end of this to see if it gets stuck there and if it does continue on error or not. By the way, during the pre-boot environment, you have an option. You can hit the F8 key and get to a command prompt, and then you can check out the smsts.log file. We'll take a look at that later on while it's going through this so you can troubleshoot. Okay, so we're at the end of applying image. It should apply Windows settings next. Let's see what happens. Okay, looks like we've got through our sticking point. It might have failed on apply Windows settings, and just continued, but we got to the device driver. It's setting up the Configuration Manager client. We got a lot further this time. So we'll let this run its course. We'll watch it, and then we'll check out the log file when it boots from Windows and check out the status of everything and see what worked and if anything failed, what failed. Okay, great. So now we've got the computer's going to restart. I did add this step just before it installs the applications to the task sequence. It's a good idea to let the computer restart after the operating system's installed and the Windows settings are there, so that and the Configuration Manager client is installed, so that everything comes into effect. And it went through another restart. That may be after the application's installed, but again, we'll see. Okay, so it did come back up with the task sequence, and it looks like it's configuring the Configuration Manager client or finishing the installation. So not really sure at what point we are in the task sequence, but we'll let it run and continue to monitor. So now it's going on to the other steps and restarting the computer now. Does it fail? Probably on the script, but that's okay. Let's go ahead and close that and restart. And now it's going through the out-of-the-box experience again. We'll pause until this is done and take a look when it reboots at what we've got. So it's already looking better. You can see here that it seems to have joined the domain. It says sign into the domain. So that's a good sign. Let's give that a shot. So we'll come back after this is logged on and we'll validate quite a few things, and we'll take a look at that log file. We'll take a look at it from the MECM side too, as well, with the Configuration Manager client, and see that it's active and all that kind of stuff. So we'll do that next. So the first thing we check out is we see in File Explorer that indeed the hard drive is encrypted with BitLocker. So that worked. We see the BitLocker key, and if we went into right-click on the drive and say Manage BitLocker, we will see that it says BitLocker is on. So we know that that worked. That's good. So we can close that out. We can also see, if we go to Settings, System, and About, that we click on Domain or Workgroup to check and see. Now, we already know that it's joined to the domain because I successfully logged in, but just for validation, let's make sure. Click on Domain or Workgroup, and we can see that the domain join worked. That's good. So that part worked as well. If we go to a domain controller and we go to the OU, we told it to put that computer in. After it's domain joined, we see that computer in there. So that worked. Doing good so far. Now, the Windows product key did not seem to work for KMS. It also seems to have failed to install the applications that I wanted to install. I don't see Google Chrome, and I don't see Microsoft Office, the version that I installed. So what I want to say at this point is, this is normal. you're going to go through a certain amount of testing on test devices to get your task sequence exactly the way you want it. You're going to go through a couple of iterations, validate, and keep going, check through the errors, fix any issues that you have, and run it over and over again until you get it exactly the way you want. Once you get it the way you want, it's very seldom going to change. The only thing you're probably going to change is adding applications, occasionally updating applications in there, and also updating the operating system images, or just applying Windows updates to it. But usually you do those through the automatic deployment rules. If we look in the control panel, we can see that we have the Configuration Manager applet, which means that the Configuration Manager client is installed. So if we click on that, we're going to see that indeed it's connected to the site. We've got all the actions that we can enforce, so we're pretty well assured that the client has been fully installed. So we can close that out. We can check out the SMSTS, which is the task sequence log, in your C drive Windows SCCM logs folder after installation. Before installation, it's in your X drive during the task sequence X drive. If you go to a command prompt, X drive, Windows temp, SMS logs, and then there's the smsts.log file in there. So we can open that file, smsts, but I don't recommend opening it as a regular text file in Notepad. I mean, it's really hard to read. I used to say open it with CM Trace, but apparently there's a nicer tool now. I didn't know this until recently that replaces a CM Trace for viewing log files in Configuration Manager called the Support Center. And if you go to your CCM server, MECM server, and go to your site share, there's a folder called Tools and Support Center. And the Support Center installer is underneath there. And if you install it, you're going to find a tool called Support Center Client Tools. Let's see if I can highlight that for you. And another one, which is the one we really want, Support Center OneTrace for viewing the log files. So let's go ahead and open that and view that log file with OneTrace instead of CM Trace. OneTrace is the newer version, a little more elaborate. And then I went on the bottom right-hand side and searched for the SMSTS log file inside of the logs. So here's where I'm talking about. And once you open it, it'll go to the top of the list. And you basically double click on it and you'll get the whole log file opened up here. And so you can look through the log file at each step along the way, and it'll give you the icons for the type of information that it is, or warnings or errors, so that you can sort through here and find the errors and zone in on the errors that were encountered during the task sequence to find out what failed. So if we filter with severity greater than equal to warning, then we're going to find all the warnings and errors, but I'm going to just go error. I want to find just the errors right now and apply. And it's going to highlight all the errors, and I can click on each one of these and find out what failed and get somewhat of an indicator as to why it failed. And then I can right click and say copy log text, go to your favorite browser and search by pasting that in there, and boom. Let's find out why this failed. So we're not going to go through every single one of these errors and resolve them. It's not the goal. The goal is to show you some troubleshooting techniques and some tools that you can use to troubleshoot task sequences, because there's way too many things you can run into in any environment to cover even a small percentage of the issues. But the procedure is just keep working away at any issues that you may find and keep testing each time until you get it exactly the way you want it. We can also take a look at this from the MECM console end and go back to monitoring. Last time we were monitoring distribution status. Now we're actually going to go to monitoring and take a look at deployment status. So we've only deployed one thing so far, and that's our task sequence. So if we expand this, take a look at our task sequence, we're going to see it listed along with any other deployments, and we're going to see that it failed right there. Error is 1. Didn't fail on everything. Had some error issues. But again, we can go to view status and click on that, and it'll bring us to the actual status of what happened. So we're going to click on error, and click up top where the error is, and then any errors according to that deployment ID or machine or whatever it is will be listed below. So this is for this machine right here. If we look at this, we can double click on it. It's going to tell us Task Sequence Manager could not successfully complete execution of the task sequence. But we can get a much better view on the status tab up top for each step along the way. And if we make this bigger, we're going to get a lot more information. We're going to see what the group name is. We're going to get specific errors along the way or specific messages that we can get some more information on. And just kind of go through the list and see if we can find the information that we're looking for to help troubleshoot. Now, the interesting thing is that so far I have not seen anything that indicates that those applications have failed, other than I don't see them on this computer. And I don't see them in the programs and features. So we have a couple options. We can run the whole task sequence again once we tweak everything and find out, if our remediations have worked. But that takes quite a bit of time. But specifically for applications that fail during a task sequence, you can choose to install those after the task sequence by putting those computers that you just freshly imaged into a collection and deploy the applications directly to that collection. And that's what I'm going to do. And that can be either just for testing to see if the application installs outside of the task sequence, or just as part of your procedure. You install applications outside of the operating system deployment task sequence. So for instance, I'll go to Google Chrome and I'll say, okay, well, I know it's already distributed to my distribution point. It didn't work during that group and step on the operating system deployment task sequence. And by the way, we did say continue on error, and that's probably why we didn't see any error in the log, but not really sure. And we can say, okay, well, let's try to deploy it directly to the machine and see through the collection, whatever we put in that test collection. We're only going to put machines we want to test in that test collection. So we're going to go to the collection that I have created, the device collection, and I'm going to go to test deployments and okay. And I've got that one machine I just imaged in there. And I'm going to, actually, I've already got it distributed. You can see that up top here. So I don't need to distribute it to any other distribution points in my lab environment anyways. So I'm just going to click on next. And I'm going to say install, but this time I'm going to say required. I don't want the user to have to find it in the software center and click on it. I want to force the installation. And I'm going to leave everything else as is for now on this page. And just like before, I'm going to say schedule the application to be available at immediately, basically. Click next. I'm going to say display in the software center and allow all notifications because I'm in test mode here. And I'm going to say if the deadline's reached, still install the software. If a system restart is required, go ahead and do it. Commit changes, all that. I want it to be deployed ASAP so I can test it. Click next. You can create alerts if you want to. I'm not going to do that because I'm going to check it manually. Next. And now that's going to be deployed to the collection, and then via proxy the collection, any computers that are in that collection and our one machine we just imaged is in that collection and only that machine. So let's see if this works. And we'll do the same thing for the Office 365 app, just to see if there's a problem with deploying the app itself, or if it was a problem with the way we set it up in the task sequence. So we'll do the same thing here. Required as soon as possible. Display all notifications. Force it. Next. Next. And then we'll monitor the deployments in just a minute. So going into the software center on that machine we imaged that we just pushed the applications to as required. Looks like Google Chrome is installing. We can see that right here. And then it'll go to Office 365 after that. So we'll check the status and see if they actually install. And that's one way of troubleshooting to see if they install outside of the task sequence. And if they do, well, then you say to yourself, okay, is that okay for us to just have a separate process or even a separate task sequence for applications? Because we're probably going to have different applications for different user needs anyways. probably not going to be the same for every type of machine. Different departments, different users are going to require different software. Or do we want to have some base applications installed during the task sequence and make sure those ones work during the task sequence and everything else will assign after the task sequence? And that's your task. So Office 365 installed as well. And if we check the Programs menu, we see Chrome. That's installed. So we validated that Chrome works. And we see the Office apps such as Word is installed, Outlook Classic, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook New, all of those. So this is a subsequent retry of the task sequence. I changed one thing in the task sequence, and that's underneath the Install Applications group. I changed the computer restart from the Windows PE environment to the operating system that is on the computer. And that is at the end, after Windows has installed and been configured, and the Configuration Manager client has been installed and configured, and the restart has already happened for all of that. This is a subsequent restart. So instead of restarting into Windows PE from the boot file, we're restarting in Windows, and that seems to have done the trick. We'll check on that in just a little bit to make sure the applications indeed did install through the task sequence. And now it's moved on to installing Office 365. So far, so good. So this task sequence, I didn't get any errors on. So we'll check out a few things on this that we previously ran into errors with. Check out the log files, check out the MECM console, the monitoring, and see if we have any change in the status of the task sequence. Logging into the domain. So checking a few things on this iteration of the task sequence. What we see is that we've got BitLocker enabled. That's good. We've got the local administrator account that we created through the script created. That's good. We've got the Configuration Manager applet. That's good. Looks like it's communicating well with the site. That's good. We also have one of our apps installed, Google Chrome. And previously, we had an issue with that. So that's good. If we were to click on that, that will launch. And so we will just test it really quickly. Make sure everything works. And it's Google Enterprise, so it's not going to prompt us for all that personal stuff, which is great. So that's done. I did not see Microsoft Office. And if we take a look at the smsts.log file, which again is in this folder after installation completes of the task sequence, we do that and we filter for errors. I see that it says install application action failed Office 365. So it tells me that, and we're looking right here, tells me that Office 365 failed. So we made some progress. One application succeeded, one failed, still continuing to troubleshoot, but most everything looks like it worked except for that one application, as well as the product key during Windows setup. So taking a look at what I changed in the task sequence to get that Google Chrome application in this entire step to try to run the group anyways, is I went to the first step, restart computer, and I took a look at what I had configured in there for restart computer. Because I know that we should restart the computer after the operating system is loaded from the task sequence and the Configuration Manager client is installed and configured before we install applications as a best practice. It may work before that, but if you have trouble, that's the way to do it. And I noticed that I previously had selected after restart to load the boot image assigned to the task sequence, and that's not going to work. So I selected the currently installed default operating system, and that did the trick, at least for Google Chrome. So Office 365, that's probably just an application thing. Maybe it's the way I created the application. Maybe there's some quirk with that Office application now. Doesn't work the way it used to work. Who knows? We'll troubleshoot that a little bit. But we're getting closer and closer. So I encourage you to check out some more articles on further troubleshooting, operating system deployment, task sequence issues, and just task sequence issues in general. I did put a hyperlink here and in my description of this video. Some pretty good information comes out of this guy's site. It does require that you watch a brief ad. I also recommend that you watch my video on creating your first primary site in MECM. If you like my videos, please consider becoming a subscriber, a supporter to my Buy Me a Coffee page, and that's listed also in the description. Remember to like, subscribe, comment, and click on notifications. Hope you enjoyed this video. See you in the next one.